The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $55, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Marsh Eldredge did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought, a massive round cast-iron Cannonball floor safe sitting dead on the gravel at the end of the row. A great riveted iron ball the size of a small boulder rolled onto 4 squat cast-iron casters, near 1,000 pounds of it, a heavy round combination door welded shut along the seam, the dial seized solid under 40 years of rust. A safe the whole county swore had been welded shut and empty since before the war, that 100 bidders had walked past and waved off as a ball of dead scrap nobody could move and nobody could open, and that Marsh had just paid $55 to own, casters and welded door and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel lot at the end of summer at a county estate auction held in the grassy yard beside a weathered gray barn on the edge of a small farming town. Marsh was 69 years old, lean and a little stooped through the shoulders from a lifetime of bending over heavy work, with a deeply lined face gone sun-brown and weathered. Short white hair under a flat tweed cap, white stubble, and pale, stubby eyes that did not move fast. His hands were thick and scarred across the knuckles, the fingertips worn smooth, the hands of a man who had spent 50 years opening things other men had locked and could not open again. Marsh had worked the trade his whole life, a safe and vault man. The one they sent for when a combination was lost, or a dial was frozen, or a strong box had to come open without being torn apart, until the banks went to time locks and electronics, and the old men who could feel a wheel drop by hand were quietly let go. The man who laughed was Del Scary, who ran the biggest scrap-and-salvage operation in 3 counties. A heavy-set man of about 54 in a loud green plaid sport coat he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a cigar in the other. $55, Del said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $55 for a Cannonball, old-timer. That thing's been welded shut since before you and I were born. The dial's dead, the door's welded solid, and it's 1,000 pounds of nothing. Nobody's opened that ball in 40 years because there's nothing in it to open it for. They welded it because it was empty, hauled it out of the old bank like a wrecking ball, and left it to rust. You didn't buy a safe, you bought a boulder with a wheel on each corner, and you paid $55 for the privilege of moving it. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the Cannonball, and it stuck for the rest of that month. The crowd laughed because Del laughed, the way a crowd does. Marsh stood through it without a change in his face, his thumbs hooked in his apron strings, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it was stuck and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe. Because the people who stay for stories like Marsh's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Marsh said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Del Scary could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Marsh had stood in front of that round safe with more than 50 years awake in him, and something older besides. The crowd saw 1,000 pounds of dead iron with a frozen dial. Marsh saw the safe. He saw the heavy riveted ball under the rust, The cast iron casters made to roll a half-ton sphere across a bank floor, the worn combination dial, and the round door, all of it built by a maker who took pride in it, set for a bank that trusted it. He saw the welded seam, and the weld was wrong. It was laid in a hurry, beaded and uneven, run by a hand that knew how to strike an arc, but was not a safe man's hand, not the clean factory line of a safe sealed at the works. Somebody had welded that door shut fast, on purpose, in a bad hour, and Marsh knew the iron. He had apprenticed as a young man under the old safe man who first sold that very Cannonball and set it into the floor of the town bank decades before, had stood at the man's elbow and watched him level it on its casters and spin the new dial and call it the soundest safe in the county. The rest of them were pricing the iron by the pound. Marsh knew the difference between a safe that was welded because it was empty and a safe that was welded because of what was inside it, and what Marsh found when he cracked that round door open that night would change how a whole town remembered a man it called a thief for 40 years. Marsh had come up hard. He went to work young alongside the safe and vault trade, learning the dials and the drill points and the long patient feel of a lock, and across the years made himself into the kind of safe man, a banker called by name, when a vault would not open, and no manual would say why. His wife Della had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own, and after Della was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his shop with his tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his memory. He knew that. He bid on the safe anyway. He bid because he knew it. A welded safe is a question, and a man who had opened 1,000 locked things could no more walk past a wrong weld for scrap than walk past his own past. The crowd had seen a boulder. Marsh had seen the round door as it was, the dial worn by a teller's hand, the casters set for a bank floor, the seam closed in a hurry by somebody who wanted what was inside to keep. If you've made it this far into Marsh's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, the implements and the furniture and the boxed lots knocked down to the dealers, while Marsh waited at the end of the row beside the round safe. When the auctioneer finally came to the Cannonball and called for a bid, Dell glanced at it, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Marsh raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 55. He paid in cash at the table, signed the slip, and arranged to bring his flatbed and a chain hoist around at the end of the day. Because moving a half-ton iron ball was its own afternoon's work, and the auction rules gave a man until dark to haul off what he had bought. The story got around the town before Marsh's flatbed was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, when he was going to roll his Cannonball downhill and see if it bounced. Pruitt Hale, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing to a welded Cannonball safe but dead iron and a wasted afternoon hauling it to the scrap line. Marsh was buying a fresh hacksaw blade and a can of cutting oil and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a thing is either sealed for a reason or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which one. But Marsh did not crack the safe open in the daylight, with the dealer's trucks still on the lot and Dell holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out and he had the round safe home, rolled off the flatbed and chocked on its casters in the middle of his shop floor under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night after the town had gone quiet and the windows up the street had gone dark. The seam was welded and the dial was seized. And rather than torch the whole door off and ruin it, he worked it slow, ground the hurried weld bead back to bright metal, worked penetrating oil into the frozen dial day after day in his mind, and hour after hour at the bench, the way you open a thing somebody else closed in a hurry, feeling for the old wheels to wake under his fingers. And when the last of the bad weld parted and the seized dial finally broke loose and turned, the heavy round door swung back on its hinge with a groan, and the smell that came out was old iron and dry paper and dust. Not the empty smell of a scoured-out safe, but the closed smell of a chamber sealed full a long time. Down at the diner they were still asking if he had rolled his boulder into a ditch yet. Marsh set his lamp on the bench and stood a moment before the open round door, reading the dark chamber the way he would read a lock before the first wheel. The safe had its own long, sad history, and the town had let it go to rust with never once asking after it. It ran all the way back to the man who had welded that door shut in a bad hour, a forgotten night cashier named Alvin Thorpe, who had worked the town bank decades before, back when that round Cannonball safe stood bolted on its casters in the corner of the lobby and held the depositors' money. There had been a robbery one night, a bad one, and in the talk that came after, Alvin Thorpe's name had been the one that took the blame. The night man who was there when the money went missing. The cashier the town decided had run, his name dropped and spat for 40 years as the man who emptied the bank and vanished. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of the truth when a man dies before he can tell it and the town has already decided what he was. The answer had been sitting on 4 cast iron casters the whole time. Welded shut inside a $55 safe nobody wanted to open. Marsh started with what stood in the front of the chamber because a careful man works in order, and what he found told him whose safe it was before he ever reached the back. Set just inside the round door was a small canvas sack, gone stiff with age, and when Marsh lifted it, the weight of it ran straight up his arm, and he knew it before he loosed the string. Gold, a heavy little sack of gold double-eagle coins, dull and dark with the years, but unmistakable in the lamp, $20 pieces stacked and bagged by a careful hand. He set them on the bench under the lamp and stood very still. Behind the sack lay a flat bundle of papers tied in faded ribbon, and Marsh worked it free and found a thick fold of old bearer bonds gone soft at the creases. Bank paper of a kind no one had issued in his lifetime, each one payable to whoever held it. The crowd had priced the whole thing as scrap by the pound. Marsh stood in his shop with a sack of gold and a bundle of bonds in his scarred hands and understood that the Cannonball had been full the entire 40 years the town laughed at it. But the gold and the bonds were only the start of it. Wedged behind them against the round back of the chamber, where no torch or scrapper would ever have reached, was a hand-kept ledger in a worn cloth cover. And Marsh eased it out and opened it under the lamp, and the back of his neck went cold. It was a cashier's book, close written in a careful slanting hand, and the last pages of it were not columns of figures, but a man writing fast in the dark. Alvin Thorpe had set it all down the night of the robbery, that armed men had come for the bank after closing, that he had gotten the depositors' gold and bonds into the round safe and spun the dial before they reached the lobby, that they had beaten him for the combination and he had not given it, and that when they fled empty-handed, he had welded the door shut himself, fast and ugly, with the bank's own torch, to keep the money sealed until the law could be brought and the depositors made whole. He had meant to tell it all in the morning, and on the last page, dated the day after, Alvin Thorpe had written a few quiet lines, that he was bad hurt and did not think he would mend, that the gold and the bonds in the safe belonged to the depositors and to nobody else, that he had welded it shut so no one could say he took a cent, and that whoever opened it should carry the truth to the people the money belonged to. Marsh read it twice through, and the only man in that county who still knew the round safe's maker now held the proof of a wrongly blamed man's whole truth in two hands, the depositor's wealth sealed safe in the iron, and the honest account of the night a town had gotten wrong for 40 years. The next morning Marsh did not call a single dealer to sell, and did not put the gold up for its melt value, and did not keep one coin of it for himself, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $55 for a welded boulder, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the ledger and the bonds first to the County Historical Society, and then set himself to the harder things, to clear a dead man's name 40 years late, and to find the depositors' descendants the ledger named, and put the gold's lawful value into their hands. The society's keeper went very still over the ledger, and said quietly that a complete welded Cannonball safe of that age, with the bank's sealed deposits and the night cashier's own account of the robbery still inside it, was the kind of thing a county museum waits a lifetime for and almost never finds whole, and that the man it belonged to, who had taken a beating and not given up the combination and sealed the money with his own hand, was no thief at all, but the one honest man in the room that night. The Cannonball, she said, was no ball of dead scrap. It was the proof of a brave man's last good act, and it belonged where the whole town could understand what he had done. And the depositors Alvin Thorpe had named still had family in the county, farm names the ledger listed plain, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who had lost their savings in a robbery the town never knew had been stopped. Marsh went to them one at a time over that winter, with the ledger open to their family's line, and watched old farmers read their own grandparents' names beside money that had been sealed safe in the iron the whole time, and saw more than one of them put a hand flat on the table and go quiet. They had grown up on the story of the bank that was robbed and the cashier who ran. The ledger told them instead that the cashier had saved every dollar and died blamed for it, and that the savings their families had mourned for 40 years had been waiting in a welded ball of iron all along. One old woman, the granddaughter of a depositor, asked the safe man why he had troubled to come so far and give back what he could have melted and kept. Marsh said only that Alvin Thorpe had sealed the money where nobody could call it stolen, and welded the door with his own hands so the truth would keep until somebody came who could read it, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, so he had brought the dead man's honest work home to the people it was always meant for. There was one thing more Marsh did before the round safe left his shop, and he did it for the dead cashier and for no one else. He cleaned the Cannonball the slow, careful way over a week of nights, ground the last of the ugly weld smooth, and worked the casters and the dial back to true, not to make a show of it, but because a safe a brave man had sealed with his own hands deserved to stand whole, And he did not spin the dial and lock his own few valuables inside it and use it for a safe. Because using it as a safe was the most ordinary thing in the world, the very thing it had done in the corner of that bank for years, and there was no truth in it. The truth was the depositor's gold a wronged man had sealed out of robber's reach, and the bonds he kept whole, and the ledger he wrote honest in the dark while he bled. So, on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Marsh stood the round safe hole on its casters in the middle of his shop under the work lamp, the door swung open and a chamber clean, the ledger and the bonds and the sack of gold set careful before it, and looked at it a long, quiet while, a wronged man's last truth, kept and proven and ready to be seen, and then switched off the lamp and let it rest. He had not fitted the Cannonball to lock up valuables again. That part was never the point. He had cracked it open so that the man who had sealed it and taken a beating and welded the door with his own hand would be known one time by somebody who finally understood what he was. That winter the round safe and the ledger went where they belonged, into the county historical hall with Alvin Thorpe's name on a plate beside it at last, and the gold's lawful value and the bonds went to the depositors' families, the ledger named 40 years late, exactly as the last page asked. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter. And the people who had called Marsh a fool let the name the Cannonball drop and did not pick it up again. Del Scarry was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at, and the next time he held court by the auction table the others did not lean in so far. Marsh never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and it had brought a wronged man's name and a brave cashier's honest act back up out of 40 years of being called a thief. The museum kept the round safe where the town could see it. They set the great iron ball on its casters behind a low rail in the front hall under a soft light, the cast iron oiled and whole, the round door standing open the way Marsh had left it, the worn dial true again, Alvin Thorpe's name cut at last into a plate at its foot. Alvin Thorpe, night cashier, who sealed the bank A&D, never gave the combination, and beside it the open ledger turned to his last quiet lines, the soft bundle of bonds, and a card that told whoever came through that the man who welded this safe shut had taken a beating and not given up the combination, had sealed the depositor's money safe from the men who came for it, and had died blamed for the very thing he stopped, and that what stood laughed at on forecasters for 40 years was the truest thing his life ever left behind. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Marsh Eldredge drove over to look in on it, and there in the last of the sun sat the round Cannonball safe, whole and lit and seen at last, the open iron door catching the light where a stranger's hands had finally cracked it. Marsh was 69 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad scarred hand flat on the cool iron and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A man takes a beating and seals the truth where no one will look, and welds the door with his own hand, and trusts that somebody will come who can read what he was, so that being blamed for 40 years can never be the same as having done the thing, and a town rarely knows what was made true in its own iron until somebody troubles to crack open the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Marsh Eldredge right to give the gold and the bonds back to the depositors' families and the safe to a museum without keeping a single coin? Or was that one decency too far in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.